So we have a special guest today. His name is Professor James Flynn, or Jim, originally from Washington, D.C. He's now living in New Zealand. He's a professor of political studies at the University of Otago. He's an expert in intelligence, and he is famed for the Flynn effect, which has shown that IQ scores aren't stagnant and can increase over time due to environmental effects. Would that be a fair summary? I know that's quite a short synopsis of your life, but...
Well, the latter is quite true. That is, I stumbled on the fact, doing research in another area, that IQ scores have been elevating in America for over the past century. The gain there has been, at least 9 IQ points, probably in each generation, which is a very significant gain. A standard deviation, is 15 points.
Yeah.
And I also did a supplementary article in which I compared all the advanced countries of Europe, and I found that these gains were typical throughout those countries. And the Dutch were particularly interesting because they had gained on Raven's progressive matrices, which was supposed to be a culturally reduced test. But the gains were biggest of all there. You had excellent data from the Netherlands that showed in any 20-year period, the gains were something like 10 IQ points. So you had an enormous gain in the Netherlands. If you'd taken the scores at face value, you'd have thought that the Dutch of today, the average person, was at the 90th percentile of the previous generation.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the Dutch, because there's a 2010 paper from the University of Amsterdam which did a meta-analysis of sub-Saharan IQ scores, and they showed that the average IQ score of the sub-Saharan today in Africa is equivalent to that of the Netherlands during the 1950s. So would you hypothesize that during the 1950s onwards in the Netherlands is when the Flynn effect took place and they took a steady rise, and that rise hasn't necessarily taken place in sub-Saharan Africa today?
I think that the rise in IQ scores accompanies the Industrial Revolution. And I think in the West, such as Holland, America, Britain, it's probably been going on at least since 1900, when industrialization began to make a big difference. And I've written fairly widely on the subject that it's a good barometer as to when the modern world is beginning to affect the third world. Now, of course, there things get a bit dicey, because while industrialization may not have revolutionized the society, it does mean that some of these third world countries are exposed to the media from the first world. And therefore, a lot of people may be, who are at least affluent, plugged into the internet. So you sometimes find in these third world countries something sort of interesting. That is, people will be much better on something like picture arrangement because they've entered the pictorial modern world. They may not be that much better on vocabulary because their system of education may be quite regressive and just memorizing verses from the Quran.
Yeah.
So you get in developing countries often a very peculiar pattern, where insofar as the modern world has impinged on them, you get IQ gains. Insofar as the modern world has not changed their traditional education, you don't get gains. So you wouldn't get gains, let's say, in vocabulary as large as you would get in picture arrangement.
Right. So one of the rebuttals...
One thing I should say, that is, we can't blandly assume that the difference between generations over time in the Western world is exactly equivalent to environmental differences between white Americans and, let's say, black Americans. I think it's quite true that black Americans some 50 years ago were matching white Americans today. But to say that the factors that separate white and black Americans today are identical to those that separate the generations before over time still has to be proved. It could be different. It could be that the thing that has really influenced Americans in general since 1950 has been the rise in education, and this has made that you have big gains on things like using logic on abstractions. That may have gone on. You would still have to show, however, that white and black today differ on that trait. It would be logically possible that blacks have gained on whites over time, and the factors that are operative then are not exactly identical to the factors that operate between black and white in the current setting.
So when you say that there was a time period where black and white IQ differences were largely the same, would you say that the IQ of whites has increased further than it has for blacks, or black IQ has regressed from the 19th?
Well, that's an important finding that Bill Dickens and I showed, that in the generation between about 1972 and 2002, blacks had actually gained about 5 points on whites. Now, I don't think anyone would argue that that was anything but an environmental gain. We don't know exactly what improved in the black environment. My hunch is it's how black mothers school their children before they go to school, as preschoolers. Because back in 1980 about, Elsie Moore did a study, and she found that if you took blacks, they were all orphans being adopted. And some were adopted by white professional parents, and some were adopted by black professional parents. There was still a huge difference in their IQ at the age of 8.5. And this seemed to have to do entirely with the mother's interaction with the child preschool. The white mothers were encouraging. They said, let's try this. They smiled. The black mothers were almost universally censorious. You're not that stupid. And it appears that that study is not being redone today, thanks to, political correctness, which is tragic. But my hypothesis is that between 1972 and 2002, probably there was a big change in black preschool homes, because we don't find that blacks were closing the gap in income. We don't find that they were closing the gap in schooling. So it seems to indicate in this particular case that the reason blacks have gained on whites has to do with preschool interaction with the mother. And this exemplifies the point I'm making. That is, to merely say we're better today on IQ tests than we were 50 years ago still leaves unsolved exactly why there's a black-white IQ gap today. The reasons could be quite different.
Well, wouldn't you say that, the conditions of whites is largely better than that of African Americans due to just access to wealth and education?
Oh, yes, there's no doubt that black Americans score better than most blacks in Africa. Yeah. So you do get some places in Africa, such as Kenya, where blacks are making big gains. But in Kenya, you have an unusual situation. You have a younger generation which is very web literate. That is, you have a lot of kids in Kenya, which, unlike, let's say, some of the South African blacks, who really know how to use the internet and become quite expert at it. Yeah. So you can't just take blacks in general in Africa. You have to specify the group, and you have to specify what's taking them into the modern world. Yeah. So if I were to look at black IQ gains on whites in America, I would say a change in preschool interaction between mother and child is operative. If I had to look at IQ gains in Kenya, I would say it's the fact that younger blacks have interfaced with the world of the web.
Do you think that the focus on the black-white gap can kind of mislead the stats? Because I'll give you an example. So from 2000 to 2020, the imprisonment rate of 19 to 20-year-old black Americans has decreased 70%, whereas the prison rate during that same time period, blacks went from 9 times more likely to being incarcerated to 11 times more likely to be incarcerated. So even though the total progression of blacks has improved for prison rate per capita, compared to whites, it seems to have gotten worse. So
yes, well, you see, that's another thing we have to take into account, that we have to compare black and whites as to age. At about the age of 4, blacks are only about 5 IQ points behind whites. When you get to the age of 24, they're about 24 points below whites. And there's no doubt in my mind that the black environment compared to the white progressively deteriorates over time. When you get to 24-year-olds, as you say, about a third of them have served at least a year in prison. Well, that isn't going to be an environment that very much enhances your IQ. So you can have a situation where the kids at the age of 4 have quite profoundly gained on whites, where blacks at the age of 24 have made very few gains at all. Now, I've written a book which tries to show how black environment decreases over time. I should say one thing that I want to get across, and that is that the refusal to study these differences scientifically is, of course, a way of really saying we don't want to know the truth.
Yeah.
You know, if because of political correctness you can't repeat Elsie Moore's study, you can't say today, you know, well, we adopted black orphans in white and black homes, and the white homes had this advantage. You have to work on data from the 1980s. And I published a book which looks at American universities and looks at all the factors at U.S. universities that discourage research into sensitive topics. I mean, kids on campus just say, oh, I know black and whites are equal. Anyone who bothers to study the problem should be kicked out of the university.
Yeah.
So I wrote a book entitled A Book Too Risky to Publish, which is has as a subtitle, I think, something like Cognitive Ability in the Universities, but it's called A Book Too Risky to Publish. And if people want to know why we don't make more progress in studying these variables, they should consult that book with Amazon Press.
Well,
it goes into all the factors, from the student bullying to administrators who don't want anyone to make any trouble, to donors who don't like the idea that people on campus are studying black-white differences. You know, it looks at all the factors that discourage research in this area.
So speaking on books too risky to publish, your latest book in 2019 wasn't published on free speech.
Well, that was the book. It's now out.
Oh, right.
Yes,
So have you found...
Fortunately, in Britain, a press turned it down, saying, oh, this might infringe our hate speech laws. It's not that you're saying anything hateful. But what if someone extracts material from your book and uses it against blacks? Well, you know, you can extract material from the Bible, use it to prove anything. And they admitted I wasn't preaching hate speech, but they said, this is dangerous. It'll get us sued under the hate speech laws. And that's the book I'm talking about. Eventually, Academica Press published it.
Right.
And the paperback edition is very accurate, much better than the hardcover. And it looks at the student environment, the administrative environment, the total environment that crushes free speech in university, and that includes investigating black and white differences.
Would you describe yourself as a free speech absolutist? Where do you draw the line on free speech?
I'm not an absolutist in the sense that if I were living in Nazi Germany, I would realize that free speech had broken down entirely. And there was no dialogue going on between socialists, communists, and Nazis. All they were doing was attending each other's meetings to beat each other up, which is hardly free speech. So I'm not a free speech activist, absolutist, in the sense that I would say that I can't imagine environmental conditions where free speech is not at an end and all you can do is face each other off and try and beat each other up. But America doesn't resemble that. I mean, America today doesn't have Communist Party meetings that Nazis go to and beat up all the communists. America doesn't have a situation where violence has replaced dialogue and investigating these questions. So I think it's taking things completely out of context to use the analogy of desperate situations. In America today, there is nothing that prevents freedom of inquiry into fundamental questions except the attitudes of people that it's embarrassing to do so.
Well, don't
And
you
to
think
that
that,
degree, whoop, I've lost you.
don't you think that free
Wait,
speech?
wait, you faded out.
Can you hear me?
Can you still see me?
I can see you and hear you. Can you see me and hear me?
I can't see you, but that's beside the point, isn't it?
How about now? Have I come through?
No, I still just see myself.
Maybe the camera's gone black. If you touch the computer screen, it'll probably
What do I do?
Can you move the mouse?
Yep.
Have I come back on?
No, let's see. There you've come back on.
Okay.
Hooray, hooray.
So my question is that when
You see, this is what disturbs me. When people say, you know, what if American society falls apart? What if everyone is shooting each other in the streets? Wouldn't you then agree we have to curtail free speech? Well, yeah, I probably would. But we're not in that position. We're just in a position where the average, by the way, I'm well left of center politically, but where the average well-meaning liberal is just saying to himself, it's an insult to the black people to even investigate whether there's a genetic component in the IQ gap. Therefore, we'll chase everyone off campus who believes in that. We will chase speakers off campus. We won't fund anyone who wants to do any research. That's just closing down free speech because you're too cowardly to face what freedom of inquiry might produce. Yeah. Now, I don't think they should be too cowardly. I think blacks have actually continued to gain on whites since the year 2002. But the data we have is not IQ data so much as educational progress data. Now, let's imagine that if we did a study today, we found that blacks have cut the gap to 5 IQ points. Well, the gap between singletons and twins is 4 points. And no one is running through the streets saying, my God, we have to not insult, twins. At a certain point, you have to say to yourself, what's at stake here? If blacks are only 5 points behind today, it's quite clear their environment is still a hell of a lot worse. And are we going to be arguing and shooting each other over those 5 points, whether 3 are environmental and 2 are genetic, or whether 3 are genetic and 2 are environmental? I mean, I think eventually blacks will probably equal whites, but I'm not an optimist, as you can see from my writings on Black America. But I do think the gap may drop to a point where we say, well, while this may be of some scholarly interest, only someone who is crazy enough to code people in terms of color should find this of any practical interest.
Right. So, about the brain size, so 19th century German autonomy professor Emil Huschke confirmed that the average German brain exceeds 1,400 grams and the average Hindu brain is only 1,000 grams. Is there any correlation between the size of the brain and maybe IQ scores or intelligence?
Well, this is trying, to connect dots together that may not be that significant. For example, they often use the contents of the cranium, that size, as a measure. And there, compared to body weight, men are better off than women. Yet my data on IQ tests tends to show that, in point of fact, women are the equal of men in terms of IQ tests today. The mean factor was environmental. 30 or 40 years ago, they weren't attuned to the modern world. Today, most women are. And if you look at that 40-year interval, women have gained on men and now equal them on the sacred Raven's progressive matrices. And is there a genetic difference between men and women in terms of their ability to progress in modern life? Well, what difference remains, I think, is partially based on prejudice, but a lot of it may be based on things that have nothing to do with cognition. They find, for example, that in nurseries, that when a baby starts to cry, female babies will cry as a result, and male babies will generally ignore it. That is, even at a very early age, girls seem to have more empathy than boys. And you also find that if you pass babies in the corridor, the girl babies will shift to watch the human being more often than the boy babies. And I suspect that if women do worse, let's say at mathematics, it has nothing to do with their genes for cognition. It may have to do that genetically women are more empathetic than men, and they're only interested in mathematics if it has a practical payoff. That is, they're interested in mathematics if you use it in psychology or sociology. They're not much interested in mathematics as a beautiful formal system. Now, I can't choose between those hypotheses. It's true there are fewer women in the area as the mathematics becomes more difficult. But is that because they find that they want to develop their mathematical skills in humanistic areas? And they're not so much interested in, look at that, there are fewer women chess grandmasters. Well, why is that? Probably women aren't that much obsessed with being a chess grandmaster. So it may be that women are just saner than we are. That is, rather than being interested in beating people at being pure mathematicians, they're much more interested in mathematics as it applies to everyday life and helps people in psychology and sociology. But I use that as an illustration. I at least feel there is no genetic component that has to do with cognition, that puts women down. There may be an emotional proclivity that makes them less likely to perform certain professions. Yeah. But men have an advantage in terms of brain size, and it doesn't seem to make much difference.
So you mentioned females perhaps being more emotionally inclined. Has that been reflected in emotional intelligence compared to IQ?
I haven't seen anyone who has, with a good methodology, tried to measure the two. Which of them would have more emotional rapport? I would suspect very much that it would show up in emotional IQ studies at some point. That is, that at some point you would find that there was a tendency. Look, for example, at the fact that very few women burst through the top ceiling in corporations. There are fewer women on corporation boards. Well, this may just show that women are less crazy than men are. A woman who is active in a corporation, she has friends, she belongs to a book club, she wants to devote more time for her family. Therefore, she doesn't work an 80-hour week to progress. Well, a man may be crazy enough to put all of those things ahead of his human contacts and all those things ahead of his reading literature. Well, that's hardly to the credit of men. Would show that women are just saner than men are when it comes to balancing career achievement against the enjoyment of reading Gone with the Wind or the enjoyment of interacting with their kids.
How much weight would you put on stereotype threat for testing scores? So if you're how much weight would you put on stereotype threat for testing ability?
Well, Josh Aronson is a friend of mine, and he's done a lot of good work in this area. But remember, the experiments that they run, where you have a white examiner who threatens blacks by saying, this is, by the way, an IQ test, and it will rank you for intelligence. Now, there's no doubt that that depresses black scores compared to when you have a neutral administration of the test, and where you say you have a black administers the test, and he says, this is just a test of knowledge. So there's no doubt that the stereotype threat exists. But this, of course, leaves you completely up in the air as to why it exists. Jensen would say, why aren't blacks intimidated as basketball players when they play with white players?
Well, isn't the stereotype?
Yeah, he says, how come they don't have a stereotype of being worse at basketball? And he, of course, would say, this has nothing to do with stereotypes. It has to do that a black kid who wants an avenue of upward social mobility will find it easier in sport than he will in academia. If you're a slum kid and you want to become a millionaire, you might well do better to practice layups at basketball than to hand in your homework, or at least there would be that impression. So what I'm saying is the stereotype because blacks tend to do worse in that area, and therefore it gives them a lower self-image? Or is it because they are less able in that area and have a lower self-image? You get the chicken and the egg situation. Are blacks better at basketball than whites? Obviously. What are the reasons for this? Probably sociological. At one time, all the heavyweight champions in boxing were Irish. As blacks were forbidden to be fighters. And the Irish were in a lot of trouble, and a way up as an athlete was a lot better way up than anything else. So I think that the stereotype literature is interesting, but I still think that this whole thing will be solved eventually by black IQ gains on whites, assuming that there's an improvement in the black environment.
So what I mean by stereotype, Fred, is that the stereotype that black people are stupid. So if they sit a test, they have this added pressure to, whites don't have this extra, internal conflict where they have this added pressure to not conform to the stereotype. So how would that weigh on the test?
How do you distinguish between blacks feeling intimidated by an IQ test because they believe they're stupid, and blacks being intimidated by an IQ test because on average they have worse genes for intelligence? I don't know any way of separating those two hypotheses. I would merely say that I think the stereotype threat stuff is interesting. I tried to invent a game which I don't think anyone has ever put into practice. And I called it the point guard basketball game. And in it you have a black kid and a white kid, and they are trying to get to a light that goes on. You see, it's a test of speed of information processing. The light goes on, and does the black kid get to the on light faster than the white kid? Well, white kids do get to it faster. And I said, why don't we have a basketball game where you have a white girl and a black boy, and they play this game because black boys have a stereotype that they're a hell of a lot better than black girls at basketball.
Yeah.
Say, I would bet you that result goes away. I'll bet you when the black feels that his macho, is at threat. And if he can't beat this girl at this basketball game, I'll bet there'll be a big improvement in IQ scores. Now, that's a stereotype thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
His stereotype is that he can beat a white girl in a basketball setting.
Yeah.
But he couldn't necessarily beat her in a school setting.
And what was the outcome of that? Was that correct?
Think I haven't seen the people don't do a lot of the research, I suggest.
Yeah.
In my book, What is Intelligence? I suggest a series of research projects that I think would clarify things. But I have heard that they may at Cornell, though I'm not sure of this, have put some of this into practice. And they found that when you put it in a basketball setting and a black kid is thinking, oh, this girl's going to beat me at basketball, that the blacks do speed up. You could also do it with people who are thought to be mentally retarded, because they on average have a slower reaction to getting to the light that comes on than normal people do. But their best performances are the same as a normal people. They just get a lot worse trials. And I suspect that they have difficulty fixing their attention on it. It's an attention deficit. And that if you actually manage to load the dice differently, that some of that would go away. That is, maybe you should give some sort of incentive so that the people who are below normal IQ are motivated to perform in that setting. I suspect that they may not match the normal subjects, but they would come a lot closer to doing it.
So I've got a couple more questions because I know your wife put a time on me. So this one is is there evidence that our intelligence is weakening in some areas due to the rise of modern technological aids such as spell check, calculators, GPS mapping? So our reliance on technology, has that had any decrease in our functional capacity of our brains due to just not having to really remember these things?
Well, modern technology can work two ways. Modern technology has convinced most Americans they need educational attainment, doesn't it? And that means they would have to do a lot better on tests that test your use of logic on abstractions like ravens. And that's where you find the grains are the greatest. Modern technology in 1900, almost no one drove a car. By the 1950s, almost everyone did, and therefore they had much more use for map reading. And today you now have automated guidance systems, don't you?
Yeah.
And here we have good data. The hippocampus is where you do your map reading. And they studied London cab drivers a generation ago, and they had an enlarged hippocampus.
Yeah.
Better read maps now. Well, today they don't have to. I'll bet if you did a study today, you would find that the extra size of the hippocampus has gone down. Now, that is a fairly trivial example of a cognitive skill that has been discouraged by industrial progress, isn't it?
Yeah.
My view is that the things that have pushed IQ gains over time to this rapid increase are pretty much fading away. That is, preschool parents have pretty much used up their bag of tricks in terms of schooling kids before they go to school. Boys in particular are rebelling against school discipline and are actually doing worse in high school than girls are by a big amount. And if you look at the Dutch IQ data, you find something very interesting. You find that IQ gains have stalled for preschool children, that IQ gains may have retrogressed for young adults just out of school, that IQ gains are still there in the professions because men still practice more cognitively demanding professions than women, and that IQ gains are gigantic for adults, old age, because today we give old age people a much better environment than we used to. They get better diet, they get more medical attention. So, but let's imagine that we have to take a pessimistic view, that all of these things are going to stall, and we're not going to get any IQ gains in the 21st century. The really important thing is not to get more IQ gains, but that people will use the intelligence they have more adequately. The data that I've collected over time shows that during this period of rising IQ, the average high school student and the average college student and the average adult read much less than they used to. The kids at university don't even read the course material. They just depend on handouts. And what good does it do you to be good at using logic on abstractions if you're too ignorant to read the history of the Middle East before America sends the troops in?
Yeah.
You can be very good at doing Raven's progressive matrices, and you may never have read a book like Howard Fisk's, which is about the history of Western intervention in the Middle East. And when you interview these kids about current U.S. policy, they say, I figure we're in too many wars, but I don't really know what would happen if we weren't there. I feel all at sea. Well, he may be a tiger on Raven's progressive matrices, but he has not read novels from that area. He hasn't read the history from that area. So he's incapable of rebelling against his leadership. So if you want my view on what's crucial in the 21st century, it's not whether we gain another point or two in terms of IQ. It's whether we can reawaken the curiosity of people in terms of looking before they leap. Think of approving America sending all these troops rampaging around the Middle East if you know absolutely nothing about the customs and history of the area. And yet the less people read, the less history they read, the more likely they're to be putty in the hands of their leadership.
Yeah.
So if I wanted good citizens, I would say, forget about IQ for a while. see if you can improve university education to provide more critical thinkers who are better informed.
Okay. So one last question is that it's interesting that Singapore has one of the highest IQs, but it has one of the lowest EQs. So my question is, has emotional intelligence been hampered by the digital age due to less interpersonal communication?
The data shows that something has hampered it. When you give people empathy tests today, college students, they're well below what they were 30 or 40 years ago. Now, what the hell has happened, I don't know. Why are they less empathetic? They are less racially biased. You know, if you say to them, should you kick someone around just because they're a woman or they have a dark skin, they'll be rising up in horror. But in university over time, they have been less exposed to problems that induce critical intelligence. And the data shows that for some reason, if you don't study problems that engage critical intelligence, you tend to be less emotionally empathetic with other people. Now, exactly why that is, I don't know. Maybe it's just, again, that if you don't read literature, you can't have empathy across cultural boundaries.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe it's just if you don't read history, you can't have empathy with what things were like in the past. Now, but I can't prove that. I can only forward that as a hypothesis.
Yeah.
But empathy does seem to have gone down among university students. And it would be much nicer if they had better empathy and read widely and knew history and knew about other peoples and yet lost a couple of IQ points.
Actually, I do have one more question.
Sure.
So there seems to be contention about whether IQ measures general intelligence or just necessarily the abilities to take an IQ test. So we use Singapore, where they have one of the highest IQs but one of the lowest EQs. So you can be intelligent in one area but less intelligent in another. So do you agree that the labeling intelligence quotient could be somewhat problematic? Should we rename the term?
We should ask. I'm not one to beat people to death on what words they use, as long as they use them in a meaningful way. If someone says an IQ test is a measure of how intelligent you are, I would say it could really be just a measure of how much your environment encourages you to tackle the sort of tough problems that mean progress at school. And of course, if you mean you're more intelligent in the sense that having got that mental ability, you'll be more likely to proceed up the socioeconomic scale. But that's the way in which the higher IQ score is significant. It certainly doesn't prove that the difference between us and Australian Aborigines is an intelligence difference. They just don't have the need for abstract thinking. They're fixated on map reading. They would beat the hell out of us if you had to find water in the outback.
Yeah.
So my answer to your question is, I prefer IQ test to intelligence test, because IQ test doesn't necessarily carry the baggage that when people do better or worse on these tests, they're necessarily less genetically gifted. It could well be that they're not less genetically gifted, they're just in a different cultural setting that requires the use of logic on abstractions.
Where can we get your book on your latest book?
I would read two books. One is The Book Too Risky to Publish with Academica Press, which will show you that there's a definite downward trend among university students in wide reading and critical intelligence. And I would also recommend a book I published in 2008 with Cambridge University Press. It has that's a title something like Ideals and Concepts in Modern America. But if you look at the Cambridge list, it's 2008. Because in it, I did the best diagnosis of what happens in Black America to try and create an environment which does not improve IQ test performance and how this declines with age, or how it gets worse with age. Right. So those two books, chapters 2 to 4 of the Cambridge book in 2008, something like Something in Ideals in American Society, and this recent book, the book Too Risky to Publish.
Awesome. Well, I'll let my followers know to pick up those books and stay safe. I know that you don't have any more corona in New Zealand at the moment.
Oh, yes. Oh, that's nice to hear, isn't it? New Zealanders were much more disciplined than Americans were.
Yeah.
Of course, they were encouraged to be more disciplined.
Well, we might be opening flights over to New Zealand soon, so hopefully Australians don't bring it back over there.
Yes, that's right. There's a question as to whether there should be a bubble that includes New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah.
That's a whole different issue.
Awesome. Oh, thank you, Professor. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You have the right to remain ignorant, but everything you do say can and will be fact-checked. Divinsky Memes.